Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 3111, Medieval English Literature for Class 3. This is the second video of the class. It's a poem that we call Godspeed the Plough, or Middle English Spede the Plough. And of course, I have the manuscript here pictured. This is a paper manuscript produced in the 16th century. It's a Tudor commonplace book, probably started while Henry VIII was king, and someone kept it up for several decades, copying down poems and bits of prose and charts like all the days of the year where you're supposed to eat meat, whenever it interested this person. Is paper, so it's a little more fragile than parchment, which one of the reasons why this particular document is torn. So we're missing part of the stanza here and also on the flip side. And so a modern editor in the 19th century made some guesses about the rhyming words that were missing, and I find the guesses pretty convincing. So this poem is in several stanzas that have the rhyming scheme of A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C. By using rhymes, we can reconstruct what Middle English sounds like, or might have sounded like, because we can say this word rhymed with this because the poem demands that, and we can use that to kind of reconstruct what the vowels and consonants might have sounded like. So in this case, we have the final line of every stanza repeated throughout as a refrain: "I pray to God, spade well the Plough." And so let me read it to you in Middle English, and this is my guessing at it a little bit, because I know the words are supposed to rhyme, but I'm not 100% sure about their pronunciation overall. As I may walked over feldis weed, when man began to err and to sow, I beheld husbands who fast they heed, with their best simplues all in a row. I stood and beheld the best well drow, to err the land that was so toch. Then to a husband he said this I pray to God, spade well the Plough. That's possible. That may be how it's done. But we can play around with this in class, and maybe you want to comment on this in YouTube if you feel like you disagree with me. This appears in a modern anthology called Middle English Political Writings. And so reading this with several other Plowman poems really does give you one sense of this genre of writing, this particular kind of work, but it really is nothing like any medieval person would have read. Again, we have one copy of this, and it's in this particular commonplace book. And one of the ways we can get a sense of how this poem might have meant, what it might have meant to a medieval person or an early modern person, is by looking at it in its original manuscript context. And so here's an example of something that's right before it in this work. So if this commonplace book is produced over many, many decades, we can think, well, this is something that was written down not long before this person wrote down Godspeed the Plough. So it begins with the Latin tag, terram terra tegat, daemon peccata resumat, mundus res habeat, spiritus alta petat. Let the earth cover the earth, let the devil take back sins, let the world have my worldly goods, my res, and let my spirit seek out the higher things. And this is carved on gravestones for many centuries after the Middle Ages. And I'll just translate this stanza into modern English very loosely. Here are the 4 points of my will before I leave. Reason moves me to make it. First, I will bequeath what belongs to the earth to it. My wretched carrion, my carcass, is nothing but foul clay. So like goes to like. I lay it in the earth. This should be familiar to you, given the poem we read on the first day. Since they agree with each other, I, meaning my carrion, will stay there in the earth. And so that is the first point of my will, that the earth hide the earth, and so on. We have a stanza about the devil, a stanza about his worldly goods, and a stanza about his spirit. And then there's a long prose work, and then we get Godspeed the Plough in this particular manuscript. So the politics of this poem. This is a poem about a farmer who is beset by various people who outrank him socially, who are demanding a portion of his harvest, 10%, 15%. By the time you get to the end of this, you wonder whether he has anything left at all to feed himself or his family. And we get a strong sense of his alienation from the law and from the levers of power. So we encounter a parson who wants something, that's a priest. We encounter a clerk who's a bureaucrat. We encounter a sexton who's a church official who handles buildings, repairs bells, and so on to make sure that everything that the church needs is in good working order. We have the king's purveyors. This is the king doesn't just stay in his court at Westminster. He moves around the country to various places to oversee his kingdom. And as he moves, groups of people move on before him and ensure that there's enough food to feed the king and his courtiers once he gets there. That's a lot. And so you never know when the king's going to be on his way. We have bailiffs and beadles who are legal officials. They make announcements and so on. They also need their cut. We have friars. We'll talk about what a friar is. On Wednesday, they're a kind of priest. We have different types of these. We have Franciscans, we have Carmelites, we have Dominicans, we have Augustinians. And then we have their bureaucrats. We also have the obligation to contribute to charity to ensure that prisoners are freed or fed, and that weeping women, presumably women who are widowed, are also going to be protected. So this is a kind of biblical injunction. We can talk about that verse in more detail on Wednesday. He also says, then comes the green wax, which grieves us sorely, which causes us deep pain. And here's an image of precisely that. This is a wax impression of a metal seal. So nowadays, many people can just sign their names, and that makes a document a legal document, assuming you're signing it to the right kind of form. But in the Middle Ages, that is just not the case. To be a legally responsible entity, in many cases, you needed a seal. And so the king would have a seal, his exchequer, who handles his finances, would have their own seal. Cities, the city of London, would have its seal, and these would be a way for them to sign documents. You take the metal thing, you would press it into wax, and that wax seal would show that you're agreeing legally to what's happening there. This is a seal that belonged to a woman, and it's attached to a property deed from London in the 13th century. And so we get a sense here that the green wax is something that's used against the plowmen, that they're outside the law. The law is something that's used to control them and to take away their property. They are alienated by the law and by politics. So we can talk about that on Wednesday. So talk a little bit about the Middle English. There's this phrase, as ye may walk it over feldus weed. I was wondering about this. It's pretty straightforwardly. I think it means as I walked over the wide fields, but I wondered about the me. And it took me a while to dig this up. I think this is probably based on the French reflexive verb, something like je me promène, which just means I walked. But you use that particular pronoun me to add to the subject pronoun. Je me is the object pronoun. Same thing, I, me. I think it's just English here imitating French. It's not something you're going to encounter very often, but it might be confusing to you. Ye beheld husbands who fast they heed. Now, this has a relatively straightforward sentence structure, but I think the thing is probably a little confusing. So we have subject I, verb beheld, object husbands, meaning farmers, and then who fast they heed, which is a adverb phrase. Heed in this case means to go someplace. Hie you hence, if you maybe have heard that phrase. Heed also means to hide yourself. It's a different verb, but they're pronounced the same. They're spelled the same. It's a little a little confusing. So this whole thing can be done as to go quickly. I saw how quickly the farmers went to do, etc., etc. And so should have reached the parson pray that hath the teeth sheaf of the Lund. And so by law, the praying priest who has the 10th part of the harvest of the land. So teeth, of course, means 10%. And that is, we would translate as who in modern English. Middle English at this time does have the interrogative pronoun who, like who are you? But it doesn't have the relative pronoun who, like she is the person who stole my dog, or this is the priest who has the 10th part of the harvest. So in modern English, we would translate that as who. I often see, however, the students will use that and who interchangeably. That's fine. That's just the way English works. But we do have this brand new wonderful thing, which is the relative pronoun who, and I like it. Or else full still the Plough may stand, or else very quietly the plow may stand, the plow may not move. It might just stop working altogether. So full is a word you're going to encounter very often in Middle English. It's an intensifier. It just means completely or fully or very. You're going to encounter it very, very often. So just file it away and be familiar with it. And one more thing, which is about that F ending, which is probably the thing you expected to see in Middle English, because that's what you think of as older English is looking like, using F. So we have this sentence, for example, then cometh priests that goeth to Rome. That's the eth ending twice. Eth cometh, and then eth go plus eth equals goeth. So this may seem old-fashioned to us, but I think it's really important to recognize that this is actually these two forms of the verb endings where you might say comes or cometh would have been used simultaneously in the late Middle Ages. Why is this? Because the S ending is the northern form and the eth ending is the southern form. And we could even split it up even further into southern, Midlands, and north. And then over the course of the 15th century and the 16th century, as people moved from the north into London, because London is where really there was so much money and so much work, they would have brought their way of speaking with them, and gradually it would have transformed the language that we have in London so that now we tend to have an S ending for our verbs, unless like we're Amish or something. So why is it different? Well, because the eth ending in the south is based on Old English, and the S ending in the north is based on some forms that have to do with Old Norse and has to do with settlement patterns in the north over the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, as people from Norway and Denmark and Sweden were raiding and then gradually settling in northern England. And there were so many of them that eventually the English kings said, well, that is just where the Scandinavian people live. And so their particular way of speaking would have blended with Old English and changed the language, and then gradually they changed the language in the South as well. Perhaps by the 17th century, by the time that we have the King James Bible being produced, that eth ending would have struck the translators as more dignified, because it would have struck them as old-fashioned, because it would have been perhaps the way that their grandfathers or grandmothers used to speak. So it's possible it might have seemed old-fashioned already by the 17th century, but certainly in the Middle Ages, I think it's better to recognize that these are two different dialects of English, and they are simultaneous, just geographically distinct. Okay, and then some interpretive questions. I misspelled interpretive. It just looks wrong to me. So here's a stanza. To pay the 15 against our A's, beseed the Lord's the rent of our land, thus by we shape shorn we may not cheese, and yet it is full little understood. Then bailiffs of beadles will put to the hand an inquest to do a sorrow enough. But if we reached well the land, we pray to God, spade well the Plough. You know, Plough. Okay, hard to keep that rhyme in my head. And so again, Wednesday, we will talk about the rhyming. So to translate that into modern Middle English very loosely, to pay 15%, I don't really quite know at the moment, against our ease, besides on top of what we owe our Lord, so 15% on what we owe, we are sheep shorn, we are fleeced. We have no choice in this. But this is very little understood. Then the bailiffs and the beadles will busy themselves to use inquests to cause us suffering unless we acquit well the land, unless we do our work, or unless we harvest well. I pray to God, may the plow prosper. Okay, so we'll spend more time and more detail on this stanza, but I want you to think about two things in particular for Wednesday. One is that in the first two stanzas, we have in line 6 of each stanza a particular rhyming word. It differs in those first two stanzas. In the last 8 stanzas, it's always the same word, enough, enough, is used over and over again 8 times. And just think about the effect on that as a reader. What does that do to have that word be the thing that's repeated over and over and over again? If you're familiar with the Middle English word poem pearl, I'm going to bring in some examples from that to show you some ways that this rhyming word enough is used in Middle English literature. This word but, by the way, you would probably translate that as unless we acquit ourselves very well in terms of the land, is one way to translate that. But I think we could probably translate that word quit in a different way, especially repunctuate the last few lines of this. Remember, all the punctuation is something that a modern editor did, which means that you can repunctuate it in a way that maybe allows you to produce a slightly different meaning out of this poem. That is something you can do creatively in relation to this poem. So we could play around with that as well on Wednesday. So overall, the big question is whether this poem is a poem of protest or a poem of sympathy. And that will be the final question, I think, during Wednesday's class. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I hope this long weekend is rejuvenating in some way for you. Okay.